Good morning. So as pastoral intern Tony kind of said, we are doing things a little bit different today. So we will be participating in foot washing or hand washing. The theme for this morning is handing down our faith to each other. So as you can see, there are 2 stations in the front here that will be meant for foot washing, and then 2 in the center for hand washing, and 2 in the back corners. So after my sermon, when we get to that point, I invite you to either come forward or go behind you and participate in one of these holy moments. So this week is the 4th week of our sermon series talking about our hopes and vision for Preston Meadow, and I've been very impressed by all of you who have brought your books back every week and done your homework. It's been fun to see you guys engage with that and get excited. So we've had a bunch of excitement around here, build up, change, growing together, and new opportunities. And I can't help but feel the positive vibes on Sunday mornings when I'm walking around and interacting with all of you. The love you have for this place and for God astounds me every week, and it makes me incredibly excited about our future together. A few weeks ago, Pastor Paul launched this sermon series preaching not only about our hope for you as a congregation, but more importantly, Jesus' hope for us as his disciples, as people who follow him and people who want to proclaim his word. Jesus calls us to connect with each other because when these connections are made, his gospel is seen in new and exhilarating ways. During our 2nd week of this sermon series, we dove deep into what it looks like to share Jesus' mission of grace. We practiced ways of doing this in conversation through small groups and our actions, and we figured out what this may look like in our everyday lives. Last week, pastoral intern Tony preached about serving God and others, reminding us that when we shine our light in the darkness, when we say no to injustice and unmoral actions, when we feel called to participate in God's mission of grace and hope, we are serving others and reminding not only ourselves, but those around us who God truly is and that he is present during every single moment. He told us that service doesn't always have to be these huge heroic acts of kindness and awareness. Rather, it can be the simple everyday tasks that remind us all that even when we are witnessing darkness, God's light still exists and shines brighter and bolder than ever. Which leads me to the task that we are presented with this week. How do we hand down our faith to others? How do we teach each other about God's hope and God's mission? How do we create disciples? And does this only include the little ones sitting in the pews? Or does this include people of all ages? After realizing that I could stand up here and talk to you about all the ways that we need our young people in our church to be engaged and confident about their faith, and how we need to also practice our faith in our homes, which we do, I also realized that we don't only need to engage our little ones, but we need to engage and encourage everyone. I'm assuming that many of you have heard the term that the youth are the future of the church, which they certainly are, but they are also here right now, engaging with big issues and figuring out what their faith means to them at this moment in their lives. They are doing what we as adults are doing when it comes to their faith, but it might look a little bit different. We are all in God's church because of the people who were here before us, the people who remain here after us, and the people who are with us right here today in these pews. Which leads me to this. Handing down our faith isn't just about teaching the people that are younger than us about God. It's about teaching the person next to us, the person behind us, and the people who may be outsiders. Handing down our faith to each other isn't just about age or class, family or beliefs. It's about every single individual. Every single person in this sanctuary today plays a role in teaching someone about their faith. Everyone is a key part in this never-ending task of creating and making disciples. It's not a one-time thing. It's not about getting a gold star for the week because you prayed with someone or came to church. It's about fulfilling our call as disciples of Christ to teach each other in a variety of different ways. Handing down our faith requires to step into the sometimes uncomfortable but holy work that Christ calls each of us to do every single day. It reminds us that more often than not, we need to change our patterns or our everyday routines if we are ever going to continue to create and form disciples. So I want you to take a moment and think about that moment that you first started to understand who God was and what your faith does for you. Think about the people that were involved. Maybe it was your parents, a sibling, a grandparent, your godparents, a friend, a pastor, a youth leader, a teacher. Maybe it was a stranger that you interacted with or someone you only met once or twice. Maybe it was a specific place, at a camp or a mission trip, a family vacation home, when you were on a hike, when you were in a small group, when you were standing on top of a mountain or near the ocean. Or maybe it was on your own, when you took time to slow down and focus on something different for a little while. Or maybe it could have been an ordinary moment in your day when you realized just how good God is and your life was changed forever. Maybe you heard a scripture passage or read a book or a certain quote that taught you how powerful God is. Or maybe this hasn't happened for you yet, but you yearn for it and you wait for it, and you wonder where in the world God is. And that's okay too. Keep yearning, because we know that God is with you and that he will show up in ways that you don't expect. Now, by a show of hands, I'm going to ask you to participate. We're doing a very participatory service today, so bear with me. But how many of you were able to think of at least one moment, person, or place that taught you about your faith in God? Just raise your hand. All right, you can put your hands down. And now, here's another question, and there's no shame in answering this honestly. How many of you know the person in the pew next to you or behind you well enough to know their faith story and their moments in their lives? Okay, a few of you. Good. You can put your hands down. So what I'm trying to get at here is that no one in this church has the same faith story or the same story about who helped them believe in God. More often than not, we don't know each other's experiences with God or their story because we haven't asked. We've been too afraid to ask, or it might just feel weird. But what we need to realize is that even though no one has the same experience or the same aha moment or the same reason for believing for what they believe, we are still in it together. No one has experienced the same thing when it comes to the ways that their faith was handed down to them. And I think oftentimes that is why we are afraid to talk about our faith, that we don't feel good enough or well-equipped enough to share our faith. We are afraid that we won't have that me too moment or similarity, and it will force us to simply just listen to each other and realize that God is that similarity. I'm assuming that none of us, myself included, feels like they have gotten an A+ on their non-existent faith report card that we have created ourselves. And because we do not feel competent enough, we don't feel as though we can hand down our faith or teach others about Jesus or even ask the person next to us why they believe in what they do. We as humans have created a system of ranking our faith and convincing ourselves that we aren't good enough to teach each other about this God who loves us and takes every step with us. We somehow have convinced ourselves that we aren't good enough to create disciples. We have forgotten that Jesus didn't only create disciples, but he became vulnerable when he kneeled at his disciples' feet and washed them. He could have become powerless on that cross or that night, but instead he became powerful and loving for us. We forget that he was vulnerable when he stood up and continued to walk with the disciples even when they betrayed him. We have forgotten that just like Jesus equipped the disciples that we constantly hear about, he has equipped us. He has created us as his disciples to teach and preach and walk with each other. We have a vulnerable God who teaches us all that we need to know about handing down our faith, and we as humans need to be vulnerable as well when we do this. We have forgotten that we have a God who already thinks we are good enough, has already given us an A+ on our faith report, and desperately wants us to feel loved because he died just so we would feel this love. Handing down our faith requires authenticity, vulnerability, and an openness that we are not always used to. Handing down our faith, I believe, is one of the hardest but holiest tasks that we will ever do as Christians. It requires us to step outside of our comfort zone and get over ourselves. As Deuteronomy says, handing down our faith asks us to love the Lord with all of our hearts, all of our soul, and all of our might. Handing down our faith requires us to keep the words that Christ has commanded to us in our hearts. It requires us to recite them to our children and talk about them when we are at home and when we are away. Our gospel text this morning reminds us of one of the most vulnerable and pure moments in the Bible. It's one of those times where we are able to witness Jesus as a real human being participating in a holy act. The action is simple and its significance is revolutionary. Jesus conveys the most extraordinary love and commands his disciples to do the same thing, not just for that day, but for every day following that. I'm going to give you a brief history on foot washing and what it entailed during this time period. Usually when guests arrived at someone's home, their slave would wash their feet or they would wash their own feet with the water provided. Hospitality looked different back then. It meant only offering water and services of the slave. It did not mean doing the washing themselves or necessarily welcoming their guests in like we do today. For a free person to wash their house guest's feet meant that he or she was assuming a position of a slave, a position that was not honorable or desired by anyone. The only reason someone would wash someone else's feet voluntarily was to show complete devotion to another person. It was incredibly rare for someone to have their feet washed by someone other than a slave. And you guys can probably see where I'm going with this. Jesus didn't care about the societal norms or rules. He did it anyways. He did it to prove that we truly are his people and his beloved children. In this gospel lesson, Jesus takes on the role of a slave to show devotion and love to his disciples, fully knowing that he would be betrayed and crucified. Jesus kneeled at his disciples' feet to show full devotion, even though they did not understand what he was doing. Jesus didn't care what was going through their minds in that moment. He just washed their feet. The love of Jesus remains unwavering even when the devil is working in Judas's heart that night, telling him to betray Jesus. Jesus washing the disciples' feet is another act of God looking into the eyes of sin and the devil and proclaiming that God's love and power will always win and that sin and death will never have that final word. Jesus washing his disciples' feet may seem like a simple act when we do not know the meaning behind it. But once we dig into this text and realize what this means, we are reminded that we believe in a God who is truly devoted to us. We believe that God sent his Son to die for us, that nothing we can do will separate us, and that this love and holy devotion needs to continuously be handed down to every generation because Jesus handed it over to his disciples in that moment. Jesus not only tells his disciples that foot washing is a gift, but it is an example of how to treat others as equals. The act of foot washing in our text today didn't just teach the disciples about how to continue to proclaim Christ's love, but it called them to act. It called them to change their routine and participate in something that caught them off guard, but turned into one of the most divine experiences that they had with Jesus. Jesus didn't care if the disciples were confused, startled, surprised, or uncertain. Jesus washed their feet anyways. Jesus conveyed his devotion in a way that was truly unexpected but necessary. I often wonder what this text looks like in our lives today. Is it welcoming a stranger? Is it sharing our story with someone we don't necessarily know all that well in order for them to understand why we are the way we are? Is it trying something new at home, whether that's praying as a family or finding time to connect every week? Is it opening your Bible? Is it finding new ways to serve at church every week? Is it going to a milestone opportunity or youth connect or any of these opportunities that we have at church? Is it waking up to face another day not knowing what it will bring? I think the answer to all of these questions is that yes. The disciples were surprised and questioned what Jesus was doing. They didn't want anything to change or have to be more involved in their faith life. They didn't like that Jesus was showing his humanness, but Jesus did it anyways. The disciples were afraid and didn't have a choice, but they still participated and let Jesus wash their feet. And the disciples were agents of change in a world that was giving them every reason not to be. The disciples were creating change and handing down their faith because they believed in something that was bigger than themselves. They believed in God. This morning, instead of communion, like we said, we will be washing each other's hands, our feet, and participating in this holy act that opens our eyes to the devoted and vulnerable God that we all believe in. This morning, I want you to come forward or go behind you to one of the foot washing stations or one of the hand washing stations. And I want you to breathe in God's mercy so that you can breathe out God's mercy to others. I want you to participate in this holy moment because we all need to be reminded that the love of Jesus is unstoppable and unlike anything else. Jesus didn't care how smelly or gross or dirty his disciples' feet were. So it doesn't matter if you think your feet are ugly, if you haven't gotten a pedicure, if you're embarrassed, or if your shoes are hard to put on and take off. We are still inviting you to come forward and put that aside for a few moments. We're inviting you to come forward and really take in all that Jesus does and continues to do for us. After your feet have been washed, I want you to wash the hands or feet of the person in line after you. I want you to pray the prayer that we have written out for you or another one that is on your heart as you bless your neighbor. I want you to hand down your faith to the person behind you so that we are all reminded that we are equipped with all that we need to hand down our faith to others. We just need to do it. This morning, I want you to open yourself up to how the Spirit is working in your heart. This week, I challenge you to talk to one of those people that is currently handing down their faith to you or already has. I want you to call them or text them, meet up with them, email them, and say thank you. I want to remind you that you already have what you need, and when we come together to participate in holy acts, we hand down our faith in ways that we don't expect. And this morning, we are once again reminded that the presence of Jesus shows up in many different ways, sometimes causing us discomfort, but in the end reminds us that Christ is devoted to us. So please, I'm inviting you to come forward or go to one of the stations whenever you feel like it during these next few moments of worship. Be reminded of God's devotion so that you can go out and hand down your faith to everyone you interact with. I want you to come forward and breathe in God's mercy so that you can leave here breathing out God's mercy onto others. Amen.